Skip Hiller, welcome back to Soup the Podcast.
It's really nice. And by the way, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I read it in 2 afternoons. It's fun to see people writing adventure stories again.
hmm I
I,
feel like
I
adventure stories aren't as common as they used to be, so I was really glad to be able to write it.
they're not. I mean, obviously, like the hard-boiled novel has made such a resurgence that it's sort of like when rockabilly came back. People forgot about Western swing, and the two are so intertwined
hmm
that if you like one, you'll probably like the other.
I think that's one of the things that I can't remember if we've discussed this on the show or not in past, but the way that genres have just evolved, both in fiction and in music. When you
Film.
Yeah, in film because I love like the 50s rock and roll. And there's so much of when you listen to Elvis or Johnny Cash, that era of music is affected because unless you have jazz, you don't really get to that point. And if you don't have that point in the 50s, you don't eventually get to the like AC/DC rock and roll that eventually emerges. And I think without rock and roll, you don't necessarily get a lot of grunge music. But that's me talking out my butt because I don't know as much about music as I do about books. But
No,
what are your
it's
thoughts?
well, my thought is like Bing Crosby's popularity. And
hmm
Bing was very much a jazz singer, and he brought that into pop singing. But Bing Crosby, his level of celebrity
hmm
was like bigger than Michael Jackson. The
Which is
percentage,
astonishing because when
yeah.
you think Bing Crosby, you think very, very, very like not cool, I guess, because
You
at least
think
in
White
terms of
Christmas.
yes, you think White Christmas, you think of like dad things, not
No, and then you go back to his recordings of like Sweet Georgia Brown or Taint So, Honey Taint So. Uh, Even into the 50s when he's recording small group jazz with Buddy Cole, his version of Swanee of all songs is it is hip as shit. Dad, let's just say dad doing that kind of dad thing could walk into any bar and get laid
hmm
after one song on the microphone, man. And this is a guy with a bad toupee and just, but he influenced so many singers. And when you're listening to Lefty Frizzell, who is like really the first truly modern
hmm
country singer,
hmm
think of it this way: you start with Jimmy Rogers. Jimmy Rogers is the original cool white guy with a guitar who's singing some blues and Jimmy Rogers records with Louis Armstrong.
hmm
Jimmy Rogers records with Hawaiian groups. Jimmy Rogers records with Clifford Gibson. So he's like the white guy with street cred. And from him up until really Hank Williams, that style of country singing. Then here comes Lefty Frizzell, and he's got a totally different style. That's a lot of it comes out of this singer named Floyd Tillman,
hmm
who pictured Bob Dylan trying to sing like Bing Crosby, and you go to Floyd Tillman. And Floyd Tillman was huge. He's referred to those in the know go, yep, that's really the father of honky tonk right there. And who was Floyd Tillman's favorite singer? Bing Crosby. So you see a lot of things go back to Bing, and you go, well, you see a lot of things go back to Lefty, yeah, because Lefty becomes the hero to Merle Haggard. Merle
hmm
Haggard just influenced. There are basically two modern country singers that whipped everybody into shape, and that was George Jones and Merle Haggard. Everybody else is great, but those two guys are like you know, the Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett of modern country music. And Merle will tell you, growing up in the 30s, man, Bing Crosby, that was a thing. And so, like when you hear George Strait, when you hear Ricky
hmm
Van Shelton, you're basically hearing Lefty Frizzell by way of Merle Haggard,
hmm
and that's just one guy. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So Lefty Frizzell, going back to Floyd Tillman, going back to Bing Crosby, you know, and again, it's like I'm not sure how many people who uh, who write pulp style fiction now have
Hmm.
read Earl Stanley Gardner.
Yes, but they're
But
affected by Earl Stanley Gardner because they read stuff by people that were affected by him.
Earl Stanley Gardner is one of the five biggest selling authors of the 20th century.
Which, for audience members who don't know, Earl Stanley Gardner, if I remember correctly, he's Cool and Lamb. And then the thing that he's really known for is he came with Perry Mason, right?
Yeah, but he had quite a life. He was
Hmm.
he was the guy everybody thinks Hemingway is. You know,
Oh,
he put himself through law school as a bare knuckles boxer.
I
And
immediately need a biography on Earl Stanley Gardner.
yeah, there is one, but he dictated his books around the campfire. He had two secretaries, and he would go to, I think, to Temecula, someplace like that, and have a camping trip on the weekend. Bring the secretaries and dictate a book, and he was just really, he would have been a terrific lawyer because all the Perry Mason books,
Hmm.
the plot that gets the guy caught is usually a point of law.
Hmm.
You know,
And really, he's the one that established that formula for the courtroom drama that then
exactly.
turns into Matlock, that turns into parts of Law and Order, that turns into Boston Legal. All these,
The
what's
practice,
the
Ally
practice?
McBeal,
Yeah,
he,
Ally McBeal. All of that we don't have if we don't have Earl Stanley Gardner.
that's exactly my point. And he's largely forgotten. There are a lot of authors who are largely, who are so influential and so much a part of their outlook influenced anybody smart enough to be kind of cynical.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking of Ambrose Bierce.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of, he wrote the Devil's Dictionary, which is uh, basically this very sarcastic glossary of, uh, and you could tell John Cleese read that more than a couple of times. And oh man, I can't believe I'm Sinclair Lewis,
Hmm.
who
Yes.
wrote, who said, who was really like, hey, beware of religion. I
Hmm.
have this book, Elmer Gantry. Yeah, you're gonna, and in the when you saw Ted Haggart and all those guys follow, it's like, wow, this is right out of Bierce. And of course, now you have the Righteous Gemstones,
Hmm.
which you know, both Bierce and God, and Sinclair Lewis. Why do I always have a problem with his name? They would have loved, you know. Also, C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lion, the
Hmm.
Witch, and the Wardrobe, he wrote a book called The Screw Tape Letters.
Amazing book. Very,
Amazing book.
very
That's
fascinating.
for those of you who have not read this. Um, and when I was about 14 years old, I was given this book by a very open-minded Episcopal priest. And what it is it's a set of letters written from an elder, kind of established demon to his nephew, who is a demon in training and who has been afforded his first human charge to kind of turn him to the dark side. And there's an audiobook version read by John Cleese.
Oh, really? I'll have to
Yes,
check that one out. There's
it,
a
it
there's a dramatic version of it that's done like a radio drama with
yeah.
Andy Serkis as um Screw Tape.
Wow.
I mean, really, it's a meaty role. I mean, John Cleese, Andy Serkis, these are the quality performers
Oh
that
yeah.
bring out.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know who you could bring to that party now to
Hmm.
be that guy. I would think Penn Jillette actually, but
Oh, actually, yeah.
um, but I can see where Penn would have issues with C.S. Lewis because
Yeah.
if you look at C.S. Lewis's other books, he started out as a complete skeptic and wound up
Hmm.
as as a devout Christian, and not like a fire and brimstone
Hmm.
bullshit preacher, but he wrote a book called Mere Christianity.
It's a
That
phenomenal book.
yeah, that again, his attitude about the way the word Christian gets thrown around
Hmm.
is really, he's saying like, no, it's like the way gentleman is thrown around. A gentleman used to have a family crest and a this and a
Hmm.
that. Now we just use it on anybody who has good manners.
Yeah.
And I like C.S. Lewis a lot. I think he's a terrific writer.
I think as
In
a
addition,
thinker, he was
I
just
was going to say
fascinating.
he is, uh, he's got a very rabbinical
Hmm.
approach to the large concepts of Christianity, and I find that very interesting. And you know who his best friend was?
Oh yeah, J.R.R. Tolkien. Uh,
Yeah,
which there's a fantastic book called The Fellowship, and it's about the Inklings. So the writers group of J.R.R.
yeah.
Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and then I'd like to say John MacDonald, George MacDonald, something like that, and like one other guy. There were all these were professors at Oxford that just met
I was going to
together.
say there was just this little bunch of professors at Oxford, but it's like every now and then you get this little crew of writers that they're just four guys sitting around drinking coffee, but they happen to
Hmm.
be Kerouac, Burroughs, Allen
Yeah.
Ginsberg, and you go like, I guess four people sitting around a table drinking coffee can really make an effect on things.
Well, have you read C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy?
No.
I just read the first book this last year, and it reads so much like a pulp from that era, like one of the men's adventure magazines almost,
Uh huh.
because it's just this random dude. He interrupts a crime and then gets sent off to this faraway planet. And it's I don't think it's amazing as a story, but I think for what it is, it's fascinating. What's funny though is it was written because he had a bet with J.R.R. Tolkien that he would basically take Tolkien as a person and throw him into this story. And Tolkien was supposed to take Lewis, throw him into a story, and write and publish it. But because Tolkien was notoriously slow at actually writing things, it didn't end up happening. But the Space Trilogy started out as a bet between Tolkien and Lewis.
That's stranger things have happened, but it's those guys.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? That's what becomes part of the legend is often yeah,
Well, and
it's two
this
guys
is the
sitting
same
in
thing
a
with
bar.
music.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to try to get the conversation somewhere to music.
But that's how it goes. Like creativity, too often we treat it as it's a vacuum. But when you have your group, your comrades, your people that you bounce ideas back and forth off of, that's where you get good musical groups. That's where you get even independent. Like, I still find it fascinating. I haven't read a biography on Johnny Cash, but I have watched the Walk the Line, which is just, it's a good biopic. It's a standard music
No, it's
biopic.
actually a terrible biopic.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, it's the best biopic of Johnny Cash I've ever seen is actually a June Carter biopic
Okay.
called Ring of Fire with Jewel as uh,
Oh,
as June Carter, and she's really good. And I don't know if you ever watched Big Love, but the
no.
guy who played Albie on Big Love, Matthew Ross, plays Johnny Cash, and he's a
Okay.
much better Johnny Cash.
Okay.
And I actually like the guy. I forget his name was Boyd something or other in the
Hmm.
in Complete Unknown who played Johnny Cash.
I kind of want to watch that just be for no other reason. I'm a big Mangold fan. Like generally speaking, I think that he hits more often than he misses, and he makes good dude movies. Generally speaking, but
It's definitely Bob Dylan, the young adult novel. You know what I mean? A
okay.
lot of
Well, I
the,
mean, that's the hard part. You
but
strip
it's
down an entire
great.
life. Yeah,
Look, if you're looking to a Hollywood movie
to get your education.
to get your education, you're already in rough shape. And Scorsese made a great documentary about Dylan about up to that period. It's called No Direction Home,
Oh dear goodness, that sounds
and
amazing.
it's great. And I would say watch that because if the lyric is in Like a Rolling Stone is No Direction Home, a complete unknown, like a Rolling Stone. So before you watch A Complete Unknown, get the first part of the line, because the other thing you'll notice is, the guy who plays Pete Seeger,
Hmm.
uh, studied Pete Seeger. Edward Norton, fantastic Pete Seeger. And in my house growing up, Pete Seeger was he was one of the saints along with Jimmy Carter. Um, we I mean, what I grew up in a union household.
Hmm.
Mom was a union high school librarian. Dad was a union transit worker. So Pete Seeger going, "We're gonna roll the union on." That was yeah.
The point I was
Dad went
just
on
making
strike every
was
4 years.
it's amazing the amount of talent that clusters around during that time. When you have brilliant minds like that, it starts
You
to
don't
create
know
this
though.
sphere.
Yeah, but you don't know that because you could say the same thing about
Yeah.
1937, and there's like Duke Ellington finding his way to Ben Webster and Jimmy Blanton, and you're going, well, why is Duke Ellington like looking for that perfect tenor saxophone player? And
Hmm.
it's largely because his biggest his biggest rival is Count Basie, and Count Basie has just gotten Lester Young, and Lester Young is blowing everybody up the way Bing Crosby was blowing up every singer.
Hmm.
You go kind of like the Coleman Hawkins with Fletcher Henderson, but Coleman Hawkins was largely overshadowed by Fletcher's trumpet player, Louis Armstrong. Okay, you're not going to fight Louis Armstrong ever. Louis Armstrong is the guy who can knock the Beatles out of number one by singing "Hello, Dolly." I mean, like you can't fuck with that guy. And it was an enormous source of frustration to Coleman Hawkins through his life. He was very conflicted about. On one hand, he knew Louis Armstrong was greater, and on the other hand, he was just like, "Yeah, but I'm Coleman Hawkins," and it's like, and frankly, if there hadn't been a Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet and Coleman Hawkins would have been sharing the spotlight as number one, really, as soloists. But
What
you
are
go
you
like,
looking for when you start building your groups and the people you work with? What kind of are there traits or what are the markers that you're looking for when you start forming a group?
can you spend a lot of time with the person? Because
Very
like
valid.
no, because you're going to really be doing a lot of trial and error. You're going to be driving to gigs. You're going to be doing a lot of stuff where you want the feeling on the bandstand to be very like, oh, cool, who do you want to eat a meal with? Who do you want to do just a lot of basic life stuff with? I mean, obviously, you need them to be able to read music at least a bit.
Hmm.
You want them to be good at playing their instrument, and that's natural. But this is Los Angeles. There are a lot of people who read music really well and play their instrument on a market level. But do you want to drive to Tucson with them? Do you want to be in a recording studio under very tight circumstances? So the ability to do well with their personality is a big thing I look for. Also, you know, are they really into music?
Hmm.
Because I want to go over their house and hear five records I've never heard before and just walk out of there almost like drunk from music. You know, like everybody claims they are when they come out of this house. Because in the next room there's 5,000 records, and when people come over, man, we just have like big record parties.
Okay, I'm curious then. When you have a big record party, what's like do you have a go-to selection that first time they're over, these are just, is
Yeah,
it based
actually,
on the mood
nobody's
or
asked me that, and I do.
okay.
That's a fantastic question. Um, One is a great record from the 30s. Uh, it's an album of music by a guy called Costis, Kostis, and the
Hmm.
album is called "The Jail Is a Fine School," and it's basically the uh, the late 30s Greek version of country blues. It's
Oh,
really like the street,
interesting.
yeah, and this guy is really what got me into Greek music, and especially during COVID, I was checking out a lot of it. So that's one thing I play for people a lot, and it just tends to blow them out of their chair because they've never heard anything like it. And another one is Eddie Palmieri's La Perfecta, because I
Hmm.
have a lot of friends who are curious about Latin music, but they don't really know stuff.
Hmm.
And La Perfecta is that's the group that just, yep, here's the modern era right here. One group just shows up, and all of a sudden, Latin music is two trombones and piano, and this is going to be the format. You
Hmm.
know, kind of the same way after everybody saw the Beatles, they went, okay, two guitars, bass, and drums. Here we are. You know, and so that's another thing I play for people. Oh, or a reggae album called Heart of the Congos,
Mm.
which was produced by Lee Scratch Perry, who is the avatar of reggae producers. And that album, uh, that's just, you put that record on and the colors of the wall change.
Oh,
It's,
wow.
yeah, so those are the things I usually put on to just make people go like, whoa, okay, I wasn't expecting that.
And then does that give you a good idea of, okay, this is where their interests are, these are the things that they're looking for more, and then it kind of it's almost like that when
You
you're
let
at
them in
the
for what they want to hear next.
yeah. Okay.
You know, I mean, that's it. It's the same thing with running a band.
Hmm.
Um, one of the things I've learned is when the people in your band say, "Hey, can we do more of this? Hey, I'm working on that." That
Hmm.
finds its way into the music.
Hmm.
Um, Especially on the new record. I
Hmm.
was just going like, "Huh, okay." I hear what everybody's doing because the first record,
Hmm.
the Voodoo Five, it's just called Skip Eller's Voodoo Five featuring Lena Marie Cardinal. Um, that record is very much like, first of all, the band had been together for, I think, 1 week when we recorded it. We
Uh-huh.
just had
Which
a couple of rehearsals.
I would have never believed listening to it just because it is so good.
Thank you. Thank you very, very kindly. But I basically wrote the arrangements and left a lot of space in them so people could fill in,
Hmm.
and it was very song oriented.
Hmm.
So it's a singer singing in front of a band, and the template is easy for us to approach and put your marker on.
Hmm.
Now, band's been together for a year at the time we go into the studio to make the second one, and everybody's personality in the course of the music, you know, uh, Marty's ability to play very, for lack of better words, sort of ambient things on the vibraphone, good
Hmm.
textural things. Connor's ability to use the steel guitar almost like a string section,
Mm.
and then Jay and I being the more traditional jazz soloists. And then I wrote Lena's parts the way Duke Ellington would write alto saxophone parts for Johnny Hodges. Because when
Hmm.
you're talking about like what is the sound of Duke Ellington, one of the trademark things is the ballads that he wrote to feature Johnny Hodges. So I said like, okay, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to
Hmm.
mix that with spaghetti western type stuff,
Hmm.
um, and also traditional Exotica influences, but also letting the band be more of a playing band, if you know what I
Hmm.
mean. Letting the jazzier stuff, but also allowing my interest in country music to define things more, because the whole point of Mojave After Dark is really to go, well, we talk about Exotica, as a music, and it's supposed to be South Seas meets Brazil meets Africa, and it's completely fictional.
Yes.
But whenever a European comes to the United States, they want to see the desert.
Yes.
And that's the thing that's exotic to them. And you go like, wait a minute, man, I live right near the desert. This is my backyard. And Lena and I, since the time of the first album, we got married on June 23rd.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I couldn't have done better. She's just really my partner in everything about life. But we
Hmm.
spent a lot of time in the car going,
Hmm.
you know, we basically spend a lot of time on desert roads.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that. And there's a New Orleans piano player called Dr. John. I'm sure you've heard of. And he made an album in the 60s called Gree Gree.
Hmm.
And that's his like exotic exotica type take on New Orleans and the rituals of New Orleans and the mysteries of
Hmm.
New Orleans. And I said, I want to do that with the California desert. I want to do what he did with his hometown about my adopted hometown.
Hmm.
And so, so the first song is basically about a friend of mine's bar on his property out in Landers. Uh, Rabbi Chris Kraus, who's also the guy who runs the label, he put this little property together, and he has a bar on it called Luca's Snake Bite Lounge.
Oh, that's cool.
And yeah, and the minute the sun goes down, you hear coyotes, and if that's not an excuse for a song. Uh, and I thought, well, if we're going to call it Mojave After Dark, we'll
Hmm.
start with what happens when the sun goes down. And you hear coyotes and stuff like that. I said, go out and record crickets and coyotes and your dog barking. So that's in there. Kind of like it's my nod to Pet Sounds. Where at the end of Pet Sounds, you hear Brian Wilson's dogs barking at a passing train.
Hmm.
Uh, and then it goes through Highway 99, which is the freeway that goes from Bakersfield into the Mojave Desert. And I mean, and Bakersfield has such an enormous history of country music. Buck Owens and
Hmm.
Merle Haggard from there. There's like, you know what? The influence of country music on my writing is finally gonna reveal itself. And and I really thought people were gonna look at me and go like, "Oh man, you know, why are you doing this? This is just you're creating kind of a beer milkshake, by trying to involve this opposing style with exotica and film music." And instead, everybody they heard it and they went, "Wow, that's really I haven't heard that before. That's interesting."
Hmm.
So I guess we lucked out. The other thing is, honestly, the musicians are so good
Hmm.
that they will find a way to make it work. As ill-advised as my idea might be, they will find a way to make it work.
Well,
And
that's part of the fun of experimentation, and music is an iterative practice where we get genre changes through
well,
musicians doing and trying just subtle things, sometimes very large things, but usually just subtle things over and over again.
sure,
Isn't that
and
the whole premise of jazz?
well, to me, the whole premise of music is let's hear it.
Hmm.
Might fail, might sound bad, and God knows I've done some things that don't sound as well as I had hoped they would. But let's hear it.
Hmm.
Like I'm not sitting here punching the clock and writing commercial music that I think people are gonna, elevate me for. It hasn't happened by now. I'm going to be 60 this year. You know,
Congratulations.
thank you. So my my career is not based on anything commercial or whatever. My career is based on let's hear it.
Hmm.
And people say, "Why do you do this? It's really extravagant. You're not going to make money. You're not going to have this." And it's like, I want to hear it. If there was another group doing it, it'd be cheaper because I could just buy their record and hear it. But I want to hear what happens if. I want to hear what happens when. And again, with the situation I'm in terms of who puts out my records, he's not going, "Oh man, we're not going to make any money." Chris is like, "I bet that'd sound good." Yeah, just
Hmm.
be reasonable about how much money it's going to cost to do that. And there are certain things we'd love to do that we just, you know, it's just too high dollar. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Like to make a record of like a much larger band, you got to pay all those guys
Yeah.
and those women, and we just don't have the means to that yet. But that's a small price to pay for. Otherwise, I could do whatever I want.
It's true.
So I've been lucky that Chris and the Black Fez idea is just make the best thing you can.
hmm
We'll figure out a way to make it work. Just don't be extravagant, and it'll work.
hmm I mean, if
And
that's what the old Hollywood model did best was giving keep budgets low, feel free. I mean, well, I say old Hollywood. I think of the 90s when you had more of the Tarantino generation, film school generation. Let's make low budget, interesting movies. And because you keep it lower budget, it doesn't matter if every one of them makes a hit. The ones that make a hit compensate for everything else.
well, there's that, and obviously, like what it costs to make Boogie Nights or Fargo is a fraction of a fraction of what it costs to make Titanic.
Yes.
So the fact that Fargo does well at all, or Boogie Nights does well at all, or Pulp Fiction does well at all, or even Office Space, which
hmm
lost money when it came out, but it wound up becoming the best selling regular price DVD
I
of
believe
all
it.
time.
I
And you
still
know
quote that
what?
movie.
a, a friend of mine is in that movie, and he has the only improvised line in the whole movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's the one who says, Samir Nahasa not going to work here anymore. It's my friend Paul. And, nobody knows what's
hmm
going to last. I mean, honestly, you don't hear Milli Vanilli on the radio anymore at all. But, Richard Thompson still has a career.
hmm
So yeah, okay. If the biggest hit you wrote was "Tear Stained Letter," yeah, don't expect to be headlining the VH1 awards or whatever. But you're probably going to still have people going, "What's he doing next?" Because that last thing was good. Look at Nick Lowe's career. You know, Nick Lowe was supposed to be the next big thing in 1978, and now he's playing 500 seat venues and making the best records of his life. It's like great. So, and I mean, like honestly, I would kill for Nick Lowe's numbers. I'm lucky to sell hundreds of records,
hmm
but I mean, this is what I do. This is what I make. I mean, I actually put groups together and go do this and attract a little attention here or there. We're going to be playing Tiki Oasis, Arizona later this month.
Congratulations.
Uh, yeah, which is fun. In addition to Mojave After Dark coming out, which people seem, if people are starting to write about it. Obviously I'm doing press, and
hmm
aside from the fact that I get to have a conversation with my old friend Terrence, who wrote a nice book, uh, we're here ostensibly promoting this record
hmm
by talking about C.S. Lewis and Johnny
You
Cash.
know, C.S. Lewis, Johnny Cash, Mojave After Dark makes perfect sense, all in the grand scheme.
Yeah, well, Johnny Cash is in there, C.S. Lewis is in there,
hmm
Rod Serling is in there.
hmm
Because those things influence me as much as they influence my outlook.
hmm
So, in so far as, yeah, I'm influenced by Morricone. Yes, certainly I'm influenced by Robert Drasnin.
hmm
Certainly I'm influenced by Duke Ellington. But I'm also influenced by Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah.
And, and the attitude that comes with that. I'm influenced by the screw tape letters and that kind of skepticism that comes with that. But I'm also really influenced by, like, you know, Cuban and Mexican boleros, these very
Yeah.
grand love songs.
hmm
And that's in there. So I don't think I'm just cynical and skeptical, you know. Uh, but, I feel like I'm healthfully skeptic,
hmm
you know,
A
living in the
degree of
period we're living in.
skepticism
What's
keeps
that?
skepticism keeps us alive. My wife was writing a paper for something, And one of her main points was appropriate levels of skepticism keep you also curious. Because
Totally.
if you're not at least marginally skeptical, you're going to like take everything at face value. And she even pulled a quote from like St. Augustine about like my level of skepticism proves my faith because I'm skeptical about my skepticism, and I'm also it makes me know, okay, I'm not just, oh, of course, why would I ever doubt this? No, it's this is how it works. Makes it more
Yeah, that's
authentic.
yeah. It's no, it's an ongoing Zen riddle. I have more
Hmm.
of the Frank Zappa opinion, which is if you're not cynical at least a big part of the time, you're in for some bad mental health.
Yes.
Because every time a politician is on TV telling you something, it begs the question, yeah, who's paying his freight?
Hmm.
You know, every time a religious leader tells you something, you're going, he has a big house and no income tax. Remember Oral Roberts, who said, yes, he saw a 900-foot Jesus. And then the IRS said, what about your Cadillac? That's not the church Cadillac. No, that's Jesus' Cadillac. Well, Jesus is 900 feet. That must be one hell of a Cadillac. I just think being analytical, looking
Hmm.
at what you're going to see,
Hmm.
because you're going to see it every day. You might see different forms of it, but
And I
you
think
don't
this
go
creates
out
a
into the
sorry, it just this creates an interesting dynamic then with creating, I think. Whether it's music, film, writing, the ability to be analytical and skeptical on the one hand, but then give yourself the freedom to free associate and have ideas because you have to
well,
be
that's
just a
the
little
that's the
skeptical of
bottom
them,
line. And
but
every Keith Jarrett, the great jazz pianist, said the hardest thing to do is to get your technique to a good point, but not let your technique get in front of your ideas. You
mhm.
have to let ideas happen. And sometimes that can be hard, especially if you're like me and you're making music that's not designed to be popular music.
Mhm.
And you go, oh man, people don't want to hear this. People don't want to hear like, how do you know? Let's hear it. And it
Let's hear
always
it.
gets back to let's hear it. Let it fail on its own merits.
I want the Skip Heller autobiography. Let's hear it.
You know, the Skip Heller autobiography, Let's Hear It, is actually my discography because I'm somebody who's never had a long term goal.
Hmm.
I've never been leading up to anything. I'm just kind of, I'm curious about this. Let's
Hmm.
hear it. I'm curious about this. Let's hear it. I have these songs. Let's play them. You know, I just want to hear what I wrote. I don't even have I don't have the wild illusion that it's all going to be worth having heard. I'm happy letting stuff go out of print because the stuff that sticks around, that's
Hmm.
worth it, and the stuff that everybody forgot about was forgettable.
Have you heard of the Lindy effect?
No.
The Lindy effect is a general principle that was come up by Borscht Belt comedians that met in the Lindy Diner. They realized some of their jokes landed better than others and kept iterating and sticking around, whereas other ones just kind of fell by the wayside. It's been extrapolated over the years into a general principle outlined by Nassim Taleb is kind of one of the forerunners of the idea. But basically, a creative idea or business, you can usually assume it will last into the future at least as long as it's existed in the past. So, example being, the Count of Monte Cristo was published. It's been in the conversation about literature since it was published. You can assume it's going to be in the conversation about literature for as far forward as it was past. Same with
Okay.
any long running creative idea or Casablanca or music. Again, pick the big things.
Again, yeah, Mark Twain and Louis Armstrong seem to still be.
History, if history has favored you to talk about this long, it's going to keep favoring you to talk about it longer.
Well, I think the idea of history favoring you, not to get all metaphysical about it, but we're just little bags of energy. We're just all kind
Hmm.
of batteries.
Hmm.
And when the body dies off, the energy is just released, and either it dissipates or it's still strong enough to keep things moving around. And that's Mark Twain, that's Louis Armstrong, that's Lefty Frizzell and Sinatra and Shakespeare and probably Bob Dylan. You know what I mean? Like that stuff. That's the stuff that still pushes the air around. So we still got to factor it into the atmosphere. Whereas, yeah, I mean, like Earl Stanley Gardner, he seems to, even though Perry Mason is still on TV everywhere,
Hmm.
uh, he seems to vanish into the foreground more. Harold Q. Masur, for instance, who was a popular mystery writer in his time, the 50s,
Hmm.
60s, he's all but vanished. And
Hmm.
yet David Goodis
Yeah.
and Jim Thompson and, to say nothing of Raymond Chandler, they still they still draw water, you
How much
know.
do you think it's because they created personalities that the example I'd use is Hemingway. Hemingway, I think, has existed longer, not just because of his literature, but as a person, a concept, because he marketed himself and told this story about who Hemingway was. So the fictional version of Hemingway is what's maintained in the consciousness and will far past the dead version of the real Hemingway.
That's a great question because you could make the same argument about Mark Twain,
Hmm.
um, but I don't know that you could make the same argument about Charlie Parker
Mm-hmm.
because, like Charlie, there's very little film of Charlie Parker, for instance,
Hmm.
and the mythology tends to generationally go away, but the music is still, the new vibraphone player in our group, Kayla, was over last night, and he's 23 years old, and you know, Charlie Parker moved mountains for him. So a lot of it is, does the work burn by the glow of its own intensity?
Mm.
Because
Quote
Mickey
of the
Spillane
day.
has not really endured the same way that
Hmm.
Chandler has.
Hmm.
And as fun as it is to read Mickey Spillane's books, I think I've read all the Mike Hammer books. Uh, Mickey Spillane was incapable of writing The Long Goodbye or any of the really blessed Chandler stuff. You know, um, and the quality of Hemingway's work and Fitzgerald's work
Hmm.
is it's unassailable. And also, these guys are personalities.
Hmm.
We and there's a certain amount of fun, and this goes for Bob Dylan too, of like looking for the clues in what they wrote to see where their personality was at any given time. And that's why people don't just study the work, they study the biography and go, oh, Fitzgerald, that was the 6 month period where he lived in Connecticut, and that's when
Hmm.
Zelda was, you know, trying to make bathtub gin or whatever it was that you know, that you're relating to. Is, oh, that shows up in Gatsby. Oh, that's the house in Winter Dreams. Oh, that's the girl in A Diamond as Big as the Ritz or whatever it
Hmm.
is. And I've tipped myself off as a huge Fitzgerald fan.
I
You
just
know.
read a biography on him, I think at the beginning of the year, called like Lost Paradise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it has me burning to read more Fitzgerald. I need to actually dig up. I just sit down and read my copy of Tender as the Night. I can't remember which book I think it might be Tender. The author posed was Fitzgerald's best work, even though Gatsby is the thing that weirdly stood the test of time, despite, or at least popular consciousness wise, despite it being the most commercial failure of his entire literary career
Yeah,
in
but
publishing.
commercial failure at the time, as we know, things can come back, and
Yeah. Well, it did really well as a
especially
play,
because
is the interesting thing. Like
right.
Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, it published, didn't really do that great, but they did a play adaptation and it sold out and it sold really well and it did very well
Hmm.
running in the theater.
I did
which
not know this.
stands to reason to a certain extent because it's done really well in film repeatedly.
Yeah.
The I went to see the Broadway musical version um, in December. It was stunning.
No. It doesn't surprise me though because it's just such a it's it you have great material to work with, and I will say
Hmm.
this: um, I'm not bullshitting about my love for Fitzgerald. I broke into his last apartment when I found out they were going to renovate it. I said like, no, I've got to not the one at the Garden of Allah. That wasn't his apartment. He died at a friend's house, but his place over right near Fairfax Avenue. I broke in, scaled the wall and went in, like walked the steps that he walked, and went in there just to because it wasn't going to be what it was after they were finished renovating it, and I wanted to have that experience that he had.
What's your top
You know,
Fitzgerald? Story,
uh,
short story, book, anything.
well, I love the Pat Hobby stories, believe it or
Hmm.
not, which are the magazine stories he wrote at the end of his life, and I think
Hmm.
Winter Dreams is, I mean, that might even be my favorite short story overall. And of course, related, Bud Schulberg's book, The Disenchanted, which is
Ooh.
about the closing years of Fitzgerald's life, is to me even a better book about Hollywood than What Makes Sammy Run was. So I really recommend that very highly.
I'll have to
Um,
give it a read because I picked up The Harder They Fall by Schulberg.
yeah,
And I
which is
still need to
based on,
finish it. It's so good.
that's based on, right?
No.
Primo Carnera, an
Oh.
Italian
Mhm.
strongman who was brought to this country for a series of tank job fights, and he became the first white fighter to face Joe Louis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, didn't end well.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine. I read now you say that, I read a book on, it was called I'd like to say it wasn't The Undefeated. We were talking Hemingway, which is what brings to my mind. There was a book on like the history of the heavyweights. And I think it touched on that just because it's such a unique element of boxing. I watched the film version with Humphrey Bogart, and just
Bogart's
again,
last film, yeah,
Bogart is
it's great.
amazing in it. Shocker. Humphrey Bogart's a good actor. Hot take, guys.
Yeah, yeah. Who was Rod Steiger? I guess
Hmm.
the was the mobster.
Hmm.
You know, um, but yeah, it's just you might want to read Jimmy Breslin's biography of Damon Runyon
Ooh, that
because
would be
he
good.
goes into the whole thing with first of all, it's a really fun biography to read because Breslin was the right guy to have written it, but also he goes into the whole thing with basically Carnera getting the hell out of Dodge in Italy because he had all these paternity suits.
Oh.
And he was really happy to come and box in America, and then you know I won't spoil it, but let's just say the story is really interesting from every angle, including the boudoir.
I'll have to add to my reading list. Skip, is always a pleasure to chat. Where can people go to learn more about Mojave After Dark?
Go to Bandcamp, actually,
Hmm.
bandcamp.com, and just type in Skip Heller and Voodoo 5, and that'll come up there. Or you can go to skipheller.org because that's where our show dates are and all the stuff we're doing. And I really wish we had spoken more about the record because everybody involved in it,
Hmm.
from production to art to liner notes to the performances, did an unspeakably wonderful job. I mean,
Hmm.
they made me look better than I am, and I am as grateful to them as I can be. And I am grateful to you for the opportunity to sit around and talk about books and music and all the stuff that, when you come to California, we'll sit around the house and talk about books and music and all the stuff. Maybe we'll watch Rafifi, the great French heist movie of the early 60s.
You're on. I will link everything in the show notes, and I will definitely say again, to what Skip said, it is a premium album. Check it out. It is so worth it. I love that you guys still have vinyl available too, because that's just, again, so cool. In whatever way you get your music, get Mojave After Dark.
Thank you very kindly. Stay safe out there.
All right. Bye bye.